very constant.
Yes.
This is my kind of temporality. It's more relaxed, more elastic. Yeah, like.
Pero no está mal. Han sido como 4 minutos 5. No está pasando. Yeah? Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. We're super extremely happy to have you here. There are a lot of us who really admire your work and follow it for a long time. So thank you for coming. Okay, so Joel Krueger is Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of Exeter. He works in phenomenology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of cognitive science. Specifically, issues in 4E, embodied, embedded, and active extended cognition, including emotions, social cognition, loneliness, psychopathology, and AI. Sometimes he also works in comparative philosophy and philosophy of music. He's an associate editor of Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences and Passion, Journal of the European Philosophical Society for the Study of Emotions. He's presenting the talk Homa's Mind, AI Extenders, and Affective Ecologies in Dementia Care. Thank you. You have 1 hour for your presentation and 30 minutes for Q&A.
Well, first off, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here. I've admired so many people at this institute for a long time. I've admired the work that's come out of here. I followed the work of many people here. So it's really a delight to finally be here and to get to see Mexico City. As I told some of you, I'm from California originally, one of your neighbors to the north. I've been to Mexico on a number of occasions, but I've never spent any substantive time in Mexico City. It's amazing. So really enjoying being here and delighted to speak to you all. So in the spirit of kind of work in progress, this is very much work in progress. And it came out of a submission, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I might spoil the anonymous review process. But I was invited to contribute to a forthcoming issue, a journal that was basically looking at kind of contemporary and forward-looking applications of the extended mind thesis. And so that's behind this project. And I'm not going to talk about emotions as much perhaps as I would like to. It is going to be here in the background percolating in the talk. And so I'll get to emotions and affectivity eventually. Not quite as explicitly as a lot of you have already talked about it. But emotions are there. It'll take a little while to get there. So let me just jump right in and just say what I want to do today. So the objective here is to put the extended mind thesis to work, to think about what can it actually do in terms of making a real difference in the world. And more specifically, I'm going to bring discussions of the extended mind thesis into conversation with emerging discussions of AI-powered technology and what are sometimes called smart environments, such as spaces, environments and spaces full of artificial intelligence and apps and various devices that are powered by artificial intelligence. And specifically, I want to think, how can these technologies and the extended mind thesis help us think about potential applications in the domain of preventative care and well-being. And specifically, as the title gave away, I'm going to focus on dementia and Alzheimer's as a case study. So let me give you a little context just to set up the discussion first before jumping into the AI stuff. So some of you might know this. I suspect many of you in this room have come across this work. Zoe Drayson and Andy Clark talked about this some years ago, but Andy talks about it many years ago in his Natural Born Cyborgs book. He was still teaching and living in St. Louis at the time, and he talks about running into someone named Carolyn Baum, this woman. She was then head of occupational therapy at St. Louis, like a university name, in St. Louis, Missouri. And Carolyn Baum and her colleagues were puzzled by an observation they found. So they found that in a sizable subpopulation of individuals in inner city St. Louis, Missouri, in the US, were able to live alone and to relatively successfully, despite faring very badly on standard tests for Alzheimer's and dementia. So these are people who should not have been able to function as effectively as they did on their own. And Baum and colleagues were puzzled by this. So how did they do this? Whoops. Well, the answer was they used, even though they didn't know they were doing this, they used extended mind style strategies to scaffold cognition, attention, and affect. So their homes were organized as an extension of their mind, essentially. They were organized with various props, with tools, with aids. and other design choices, all of which help to support their memory, their agency, and to regulate their emotions. So just to make this a little more concrete, so many people use strategies of having dedicated message centers, what they call memory books. These were places where they would store important information, calendar items. Photo centers were ways of, they would have important pictures from their life, relationships, family members, friends, but not just the pictures. Many of the individuals actually would use yarn or twine of some string to demonstrate relationships. So it was a way of preserving kind of broader relationships. Individuals would label drawers with important labels to help them find things very quickly instead of having to hunt through their drawers. And then many of these individuals employed an open plan storage, open plan storage strategy. So important items like medication and financial items would be left out in the open where they could be seen so that individuals wouldn't have to spend time hunting for them. So a really interesting case study, and I was interested in that from a philosophical perspective, but I'm also someone who's interested in the applied practical dimension of the things that we talk about as philosophers. And I think this way of thinking about these extended mind style strategies in dementia care has informed what recently has been called materialities of care. So Christina Hughes is a sociologist at York University in the UK. She and some colleagues have developed this idea, and they've observed that the transition from independent living to assisted living is a major source of emotional disruption for individuals, especially individuals who go into a care home because they've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And now many forward-looking care homes and hospices kind of take what Carolyn Baum and colleagues found, this insight. Individuals essentially scaffold their home to extend their mind. They take that principle and allow individuals to bring essentially bits of their mind with them into these care homes. So they can bring their own furniture and personal objects into these assisted living spaces. And this has had a really positive impact on the emotional well-being of these individuals. It helps them preserve their sense of identity, a sense of self. It also creates a kind of affective ecology, you might say. Bringing their own, again, their own scaffolding with them helps to organize and regulate memories, their narratives, all sorts of narrative associations with the objects, the pictures, the mementos they bring. Scaffolds bodily habits when they have their stuff around them. This stuff kind of brings online, it enacts, helps to kind of bring out certain bodily habits and make them feel more at home in that space. So that's just kind of a background context for what I want to talk about today. Now, I want to think about some of these same ideas, but I want to also think about what AI might contribute to this discussion. And specifically, I'm going to help myself to Karina Bold and Jose Hernandez Borrallo's 2021 paper, where they developed this notion of AI extenders. Some of you might have come across this. I'll spend some time talking about it if you're not familiar with this idea. And I want to apply this idea to think about the future of these sorts of strategies, these materiality of care strategies, you might say, in dementia care. And what I want to suggest, I think the main idea I want to try and put forward today is that AI extenders are promising in this domain because they potentially afford at least richer and more durable forms of scaffolding, kind of richer and more durable forms of multidimensional integration with the individuals they support than do what we might call old school extenders, so non-AI extenders. And more precisely, what I'm going to try and convince you of and show you is that these AI extenders can be tailored in very fine-grained, specific ways to a user's particular needs, their values, and their preferences. And crucially, they can do much of this work on their own. They exhibit a kind of agency and independence, these artificial systems. Now, that's both part of their promise, but it's also part of what's going to raise some important ethical issues we'll talk about a little bit later. So here's the structure of the talk, a bit of background to kind of set the scene. AI extenders in dementia care, then the so what question, why does this matter philosophically, and then I'll end with some final thoughts. And the final thoughts bit is where I'll get into some genuine ethical concerns. So I don't want to pretend or put forward this picture of a kind of naive techno-optimism, that I think these are just great things, AI is coming, let's all just embrace our robot overlords and just surrender to the robots. I don't think that at all, but I do think there's a lot of promise potentially with these systems. I want to try and talk about that. Okay, so some background, just to start things off. So when Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers first introduced us to Otto and his trusty notebook way back in 1998 in their seminal paper, they were keen to stress the dynamic and relational aspects of this partnership, Otto and his notebook, even if this dynamic character didn't really come out clearly in this initial characterization. And one reason I think a lot of people criticized this paper at the time, said it wasn't emphasizing the dynamics through which we relate to our cognitive scaffolding, is because it seemed that Otto provided all the inputs, all the action. Otto was the one writing stuff down in his notebook. He would offload all the information onto his notebook. And then his notebook, when it wasn't in use, was just sort of a passive receptacle. It lacked cognitive agency and autonomy, just was there until he needed it. By the way, as an aside, does anyone notice anything interesting about this Otto? So this is Otto, by the way. Most of these pictures are AI generated, I should say that up front. I thought it was appropriate given the topic. I'll tell you when they're not. Does anyone notice anything interesting about this?
Yes, 3 hands.
Yes. Did anyone else notice that?
Oh, yes.
I cannot tell you, I am embarrassed to admit, I looked at this picture for weeks until I realized he had 3 hands. And I knew she was going to try to get rid of it. It took me forever. I was so proud of it. I finally came up with this nice Otto picture. I was using Gemini's, I think Imagen 3 is their image generator. And then someone told me, no, that's just his 3rd hand. His notebook is scaffolding his cognition. I left it in. But this is changing. So this kind of static picture is now changing with the rise of AI-powered apps and different technologies. And so, for example, I think these are now things that are part of everyday life. Context-aware apps, just the apps that are on our phone that track our fitness, that track our location, and as we navigate a city like Mexico City, that keep track of our schedules. All of these apps monitor our location, they surface real-time prompts, reminders, information when we're in certain places, they perform automated tasks. So they do a lot of cognitive work, or they exhibit a kind of agency on their own. But more interestingly, they even talk, and clearly I'm using that not literally, they talk to one another in the background and collaborate. They work together, even when we're not aware of it. So for example, health tracking apps will collate information to monitor changes in vital signs of behavior. They might share this information with other apps, and then if they notice some change in our behavior, they'll surface something and say, hey, you haven't been sleeping enough, Joel, get more sleep, or something like that. Now, just one more bit of kind of conceptual kind of plank or background to this discussion. So again, I think I'm assuming most of you in this room, given where I'm at, know these debates pretty well, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But early extended mind debates, as we know, focused on the parity and the functional equivalence of internal and external resources. And so the idea was that parity of function warrants parity of cognitive status. So Andy and Dave argued that because Otto's notebook did roughly the same thing that Otto's brain did, it warranted cognitive status. It warranted being called part of his extended mind. Now, a lot of people criticize that with good reason. And later developing what are sometimes called integrationist approaches to the extended mind stressed, instead of parity, interdependence and interweaving. So the whole point was that different resources with different formats and functions complement and coordinate the respective contributions. So to make that less abstract, Otto's notebook affords a kind of deep integration with Otto and cognitive extension, precisely because it's different. It doesn't work the same way that his biological memory does, that his brain does. It's not subject to bioeffects like recency, chunking, decay. But that's what makes it a useful cognitive extender. That's the idea. Now, for our purposes, what we're interested in today is with many old school extenders, like, again, Otto's notebook, model, maps, these sorts of things, users are the ones that initiate this integration process. They, in a sense, reach out to the object and kind of initiate the extension. But what's interesting about AI and AI-driven resources are that they often integrate with us as much as we integrate with them. And again, I feel like I have to say this every time I make this claim, that can be both a good thing, but it can also introduce a host of potential ethical concerns. So I want to flag that every time I bring up this idea. But what's interesting also for our purposes is these apps and these devices and this tech does a lot of cognitive work on its own without the user needing to be in the control loop. And that's what's going to be really important when we talk about AI extenders in a moment. They have what we might say kind of lives of their own, doing cognitive work in the background, alone and with others, when we're not engaging with them. And these qualitative advancements are refashioning how we relate to our technology, how we relate to our extenders, and what we do with it, the kind of skills and habits we develop as it's part of our everyday ecologies. I just want to flag, this is a paper that my colleague and I, Tom Roberts, wrote earlier this year. We explore this idea of what it means to experience artificial systems as having kinds of lives of their own, what some of the emotional consequences and significance of that experience is. Okay, so what are AI extenders? Has anyone come across this notion? Is this something that you are familiar with? No, good, okay, great. So you'll get to learn a new concept today. So I'm big fans of both of these individuals' work. I think Karina Vold in particular is just really awesome. In a 2021 paper called AI Extenders and the Ethics of Mental Health, Karina Vold and Jose Hernandez Aralo developed this notion of an AI extender. And it can help us see the point I was just making, that these systems are beginning to kind of reach out to us as much as we used to reach out to these old school extenders. So they ask us to imagine a scenario, a near future scenario. So they say that, okay, imagine that Otto has a neighbor, Helen. Helen wears AI-powered augmented reality glasses. She's getting a bit older, a little more frail, and so she needs some assistance around the house. And these glasses do a lot of work for Helen. They can label objects and tell her what they are. They can surface reminders, doctor's appointments, reminders to eat, that kind of thing. They can detect fall hazards. If she stumbles and loses her balance, they can help identify faces, people who come to the door. They can answer questions via linked smart speakers throughout the house. She can talk to her glasses and the smart speakers will answer. And what's interesting about this is that these AI capabilities, so the way that these things are powered by capacities like image recognition, face detection, natural language processing, speech recognition, predictive analytics, all of this stuff. All of these things together help Helen live a relatively independent and successful life. That's an example of, they argue, of an AI extender. So when AI extenders are a subkind of cognitive extenders. So cognitive extenders are this large class, and then AI extenders are a subkind of cognitive extenders. So classic cognitive extenders are notebooks, sketch pads, maps, models, GPS systems, calculators, all the stuff that we've been reading about for the last 25 years of the extended mind thesis. AI extenders, again, are more interesting. They're potentially more epistemically and effectively transformative than our old school extenders, Vold and Hernandez Aralo argue. This is because they are powered or fueled by AI-powered capabilities. And therefore, as a quote, some technology is directly responsible for the cognitive capability that the extender is able to deploy in conjunction with its user. To put this another way, the AI extender is doing cognitive work on its own without the user having to be in control loop. And that's different than old school extenders like notebooks, maps, models. So AI extenders come in many forms. We talk about hardware devices, we talk about smartphones, tablets, smart speakers, wearables like glasses, pins, watches, and then apps and services that are installed across a range of hardware and software platforms, so cars and laptops and servers and desktops and all sorts of other things. And again, the point is just to really drive this home. Despite this variety, the different forms that AI extenders take, the key feature, and again, this is what differentiates them from mere cognitive extenders, according to Hernandez Aralo and Vold, is that, quote, they themselves implement kinds of cognitive processes. They are not mere static or interactive tools. They have, in other words, a kind of agency and autonomy of their own. So that's the key idea. Just kind of sum up the takeaway points before then starting to get into the details of this story a little more carefully. So in contrast to mere cognitive extenders, like Otto's notebook, AI extenders have a significant degree of cognitive agency and autonomy. And as we're going to see, because they are capable of something called self-supervised learning, and I'll talk a bit about that in a little bit, this means that AI extenders can do a lot of work without users in the control loop. They can do what they do without the user having to engage with the extender. And then secondly, AI extenders offer richer and more durable forms of multidimensional integration over multiple timescales than do old school cognitive extenders. As we're going to see, this is because they are in various ways richly self-referential. They tailor themselves, adapt in all sorts of really complicated and fine-grained ways to the user's needs, preferences, values, and intentions in real time, in a way that old school extenders like Otto's notebooks cannot. That's the main idea. Okay. AI extenders in dementia care. Let's now start putting some of these ideas to work and yeah, see what you think about them. So let's come back to Helen. So imagine now that Helen, again, Otto's neighbor, Helen is one of an estimated 55 million people globally with some form of dementia. So dementia is a severe decline in mental ability, brain function. And let's say specifically, she has Alzheimer's, a severe form of dementia. And her Alzheimer's impacts how she thinks, feels, speaks, and behaves. So people with Alzheimer's often forget everyday tasks, everyday routines. So let's say Helen forgets to turn off the oven, she leaves the faucet running. She is finding conversations increasingly difficult to follow, faces difficult to remember. She routinely loses track of time and she forgets to do things. She might be in the middle of an activity and forget what she's doing. And then, of course, there's an affective consequence to all of this. She's increasingly anxious, she's depressed, apathetic. These are all common affective experiences in dementia and Alzheimer's. Now, first-person accounts of dementia and Alzheimer's show that it's not unusual for people with Alzheimer's to describe feeling that their grip on the world is somehow weakening. So part of the affective character of their experience is that they start to feel more unmoored, we might say, that kind of they've lost their grounding in the world. They feel somehow less real. Now, Helen's smart glasses, like Otto's notebook, can help. They help her feel more connected to the world, more grounded in her everyday environments. They impact, in other words, her agency and her affect. And this is something that was weirdly ignored for many years in extended mind debates. I mean, in the earliest discussions of Otto, there was no consideration for how Otto's notebook helped Otto with emotion regulation. It didn't just do cognitive work for him. It made him feel more secure, more confident as he went around the world and did things, like go to the Museum of Modern Art and whatever he did in the original paper, I can't remember. But there was little discussion of that. But clearly, this technology and Helen's smart glasses are going to impact her agency and her affect. But what makes this notion of an AI extender interesting here is that they're going to give Helen a deeper sense of confidence and security than Otto's notebook could. So let me spell out now, let's kind of broaden our perspective here and spell out what this picture looks like. Take a step back, and let's now imagine that Helen's entire house is an AI extender. She lives in a smart environment, ambient smart environment. I should say, by the way, so as I mentioned, all these images are AI generated, except for the people whose references I'm talking about. They're not fake. I don't know why Gemini decided, I tried all sorts of different prompts, and every prompt I tried, I wanted a picture of a near future smart home. Every prompt I tried, there were 2 humanoid robots. It decided that there had to be 2 bots, so the future is 2. Yeah, I guess we're not going to have 1. Gemini has decided we're all going to have at least 2 robots in our future home. So there you go. You heard it here first. Okay. So let's think about, in other words, this idea that Helen's home is now, again, an AI extender. Her entire house is an AI extender, part of her extended mind. And I should note, by the way, it's an expensive AI extender. So this technology is expensive, and it's not going to get much cheaper in the near future. So that's a consideration. The issues of accessibility. Who's going to be able to afford this tech? Who's going to be able to afford this care? So we're going to flag that for now, but I wanted to acknowledge that. So again, Helen's house is an AI extender. Not just her glasses, not just her smartphone, her entire house. It's an ambient smart environment. So an ambient smart environment is a space infused with a rich array of networked technology, AI-powered technologies that communicate with one another in the background and that transparently support Helen's day-to-day life. So Helen's entire house is an ambient smart environment. And I have these pictures of these people here. As I was writing this paper, there were 3 other people basically writing about very similar things. So you might know some of these names, I'm sure you do. White and Hippolito, and as Hippolito just had published a paper on preventative mental health care, complex systems framework for ambient smart environments. And then Ben White and Mark Miller published ambient smart environments, affordances, allostasis, and well-being. It touches on some of the same things I'm talking about. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend these papers and their work more generally. All 3 of them are really good. So, okay, so how does Helen's house do this work? What is it actually doing for her? Well, let me give you some examples. Start with safety and well-being. So you can imagine that an array of sensors are in Helen's smart environment, her ambient smart environment, her home, that monitor her movements and her activities. And so they activate locks once Helen is safely inside and on a regular schedule, maybe at night when the system knows she's gone to bed. Alarm goes off if she forgot her keys, if she left the oven on, if she's missed a medication. So she has a little smartwatch that gives her a little soft alarm. Wearables and smart chairs, smart mirrors, toilet seats, utensils, scales, mattresses, toothbrushes, etc. And yes, all these things exist. AI-powered toothbrushes do exist. Create predictive models that flag deviations in Helen's behavior. So if she falls, if she's a little more lethargic than she had been, if they can monitor her weight, weight loss, hygiene patterns, things like that. What about cognitive support? So cognitive support, we can imagine, comes through voice assistants and visual displays that are distributed throughout the house. So again, this tech surfaces reminders for tasks and events, medication prompts, birthdays, weather, etc. We can imagine further that this information is conveyed both visually and auditorily. So the speakers speak to Helen, they present this information on visual displays like that one. Maybe that's Helen's friend, Bob, who came over for coffee. Not sure why I didn't put Helen in that picture, but anyways. So then smart pillboxes track usage, medication usage. They send these smart pillboxes might also automatically text caregivers or medical support, caregivers for missed doses. Visual displays throughout the home, cycle through family pictures with names, dates, descriptions on them, that sort of thing. So Helen's constantly surrounded by pictures of her family. What about environmental control and comfort? So we can imagine that Helen's tech, things like her lights, TVs, speakers, smart cameras, appliances, all these things can be activated by both voice and touch. So Helen can speak to her technology as she's moving through the house. So for example, lights, temperature are adjusted automatically throughout the day relative to the weather outside and also Helen's preferences. She likes to be a little cooler when she goes to sleep and then be a bit warmer throughout the day, so the house adjusts accordingly. Smart candles, air fresheners, music playlists help set a kind of ambient texture to make her feel kind of a cozy vibe when she's at home. And these things all respond to other systems. They respond to wearable data, so data from her smartwatch or other devices. They monitor her heart rate, skin conductance. All of these things are working together to help regulate her emotions, to make her feel at home from one moment to the next. And then, of course, there's social support, both organic and digital, we might say. We're talking a bit about this over lunch, with talking with chatbots of the day. So we can think, for example, that the easy accessibility of family and friends comes by voice-activated assistants and displays. So Helen can, at a moment's notice, just call her granddaughter and have a conversation with her on her smartwatch or visual display. Natural language processing and text-to-speech let Helen chat with a digital assistant who integrates data from other devices to tailor her responses. And so her assistant will kind of pick up on health data from health monitoring apps and say, oh, you seem a little down today. What can we do to make you feel better? Helen, we were talking about at lunch, also has a chatbot model on her deceased husband. So this system has been created on all email correspondence, his texts, perhaps you've scanned transcriptions of things he's written, and they've created a chatbot modeled on Helen's husband, and she can talk to him if she wants throughout the day as well. This technology does exist now. And maybe we can imagine in maybe a slightly further future, humanoid robot is around to kind of help with chores, nursing tasks, etc., that kind of thing. So the point of all of this is I'm kind of giving you this little kind of fantasy and kind of a sketch of a near future scenario about what this might look like, this ambient smart environment, home is mine. To be very clear, not all this tech exists yet, but a lot of it does. And I think ambient smart environments like Helen's will dramatically impact approaches to dementia care in a number of important ways. For one reason, many dementia patients are cared for by what are called informal carers, so family, friends, immediate relatives, this sort of thing. And so that means that the character of the home environment is crucial, not just for the person with dementia who lives there, but the carers who are also in that space supporting the person. And so in ambient smart environments like these might delay the transition to formal care, to assisted living, which and support also better in-home care by delaying institutional care, decreasing public burden, easing informal and formal caregiving responsibilities. So the more work these systems can do, the easier it will be for informal carers who maybe lack technical expertise to still give proper support. These systems might compensate for a decreasing number of human carers, optimize the quality of care that people receive. And then potentially, we'll talk about a little later, they might empower those living with dementia and improve their quality of life, allowing them to live at home longer and exert their agency and feel more in control of their lives. Okay, so that was my little kind of near future fantasy sketch of what AI extenders and ambient smart environments like look like. Now the important question, so what? Why does all this matter? What is the philosophical significance of this? So, okay, let's turn to the philosophical significance. Why does this matter? Well, I think there are two questions. First, the more general question, what is the philosophical significance of this? But then secondly, what might AI extenders and ambient smart environments tell us about links between cognition and affect? Well, just some affect was in here, as well as future forms of AI-driven extension. How might AI extenders change how we think about the extended mind, in other words? Okay, so first, let me note a contrast between the earlier home as extender dementia case that we were talking about. So that was the first example with Carolyn Baum in St. Louis, and the kind of near future ambient smart environment scenario that I've just sketched. The former, the Baum example, involves what Jan Swaby has called a user resource model of the extended mind. Some of you might be familiar with this. According to Swaby, this user resource model presupposes, we were talking about this at the beginning, that users are the ones that initiate the extension. They are the ones, the individual decides to extend cognition by offloading information into a notebook, or in the case that Carolyn Baum discovered, by actively curating their environment to scaffold their cognitive deficiencies. So in other words, users assess their individual needs, in the case of dementia, to compensate for their diminishing short and long-term memory, and they structure their local resources accordingly. They make a decision, I'm going to now structure my environment to scaffold my memory. And the point is, this offloading is a kind of inside-out dynamic. So the individual is the one reaching out to the environment. Ambient smart environments are interesting from this perspective because they flip this dynamic to an outside-in relation. So in other words, the environment itself begins to actively wrap itself around users. That's what this creepy little hand is supposed to represent right here, actively reaching back to the user. This is supposed to be a little creepy, by the way. So all these pictures are supposed to have a slightly foreboding, kind of creepy vibe, hence the eyeball and the ghostly hand reaching out to the environment. This quality of self-referentiality, we might put it, is a key reason why these ambient smart environments operate so effectively in the background. So this notion of self-referentiality is one that my colleague Tom and I, in the paper I had referenced, came from discussions of aesthetic and fiction. So like, ambient smart environments are shaped, in other words, by a history of a user's prior interactions, and thus, in a sense, mirror the individual back to themselves, much the way that immersive video games, for example, are self-involving interactive fictions. Anyone who's ever played a big kind of open world game like Cyberpunk 2077, Red Dead Redemption, Zelda, Breath of the Wild, what are some other big, Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know if there are any gamers in here. I'm getting a lot of blank faces, not a lot of gamers. No? Any gamers? Okay, oh, thank you. Finally, one, okay. So you know what I'm talking about. All right, I see you. Okay, so, okay, one game. Okay, those of you who don't know these games, this means nothing to you, but the point is, in these big open world immersive games, the choices that you make have ramified throughout the game world. And so you can make a small choice, whether it's deciding to interact with the character in a certain way, to take one mission, which is going to make another character angry, whatever. But the in-game decisions over time begin to shape the narrative arc of the game world. And in that sense, the game world that you're playing as a gamer reflects choices and decisions you've made. That game world is self-referential. That's the idea. And these ambient smart environments have a similar self-referential quality. Over a history of time that Helen's been moving through them, they begin to anticipate and predict and reflect her choices, decisions, values, and preferences. Another key feature, something that really supports and kind of amplifies this self-referentiality, is something called self-supervised learning. This might be something some of you have come across before. But in short, and this gets very complicated very quickly, this is well beyond my pay grade, as they say, so I don't have a lot of expertise in this area. But to put it very simply, self-supervised learning is a machine learning paradigm that enables AI models to learn new things from unlabeled data without user supervision. That's the key bit. And this is really important and powerful. It makes training these models more efficient than supervised methods, since fewer input labels and smaller initial samples are needed. So when you're training a large language model, kind of very crudely, you start with a kind of training set, an initial data set, and you kind of feed it into this model. And if you're feeding, for example, pictures, you have to provide trainers have to provide like labels for this information. So a picture of a Shiba Inu, that's a pepperoni pizza, that is an iPhone, and that is a very time-intensive, a time-consuming, time-intensive, labor-intensive process. And the point is that these machines and the self-supervised learning is a capacity that these models can use to begin to train themselves, essentially. So for example, self-supervised learning can be used to predict masked portions of audio signals or to reconstruct corrupted samples. So this SSL paradigm means that certain AI models can be given kind of a corrupted auditory file, an audio file, and it can predict from the sounds that are discernible what the bits of the file that's corrupted might sound like. It can use that information and train itself to make predictions. Another application is SSL can support autonomous movement in robots. This is pretty interesting. So SSL can train the system to predict the next video frame of an autonomous robot's movements. It can predict the next movement it's going to make. So these robots are built with a video. It's getting a kind of constant video input as it moves around the environment. And then SSL and these AI systems can take different frames and start predicting what the next movement's going to look like. And in doing so, build up a kind of model of its kinematics, how it's moving through the world, what it thinks it's going to do next. I use, again, think in scare quotes. So they're really powerful. And the point of all of this is, in a domestic context and in a care context, SSL paradigms and SSL capacities are going to be very powerful. And they're going to, I think, be particularly powerful in ambient smart environments. So living and inhabiting an ambient smart environment that can teach itself new things, it can learn new tricks over time, is going to enhance the kind of care Helen and those like her will receive. And so Helen's ambient smart environment, we can imagine, employs self-supervised learning. This meshed array of monitors, sensors, and AI-powered apps track her movements and energy consumption and appliance use, monitoring all these things, building up this model over time. And again, to go back to what we talked about early on, this array of systems aren't just doing their work independently, they're communicating with one another. They're collaborating in the background. And they share data in the background and construct a kind of baseline model, we might imagine, of Helen's daily routines, her expected behavior, and then they monitor for anomalies. And if needed, they intervene. So again, falls, wanderings, deterioration in hygiene habits, I should say, are flagged by the system. Caregivers are alerted. SSL algorithms monitor appliances and gadgets. They can anticipate perhaps when her refrigerator is going to stop functioning based on energy usage or deviations, and they can initiate repair or learning support. We can imagine integrated cameras, microphones, etc., provide tailored emotional support, prevent potentially dangerous or escalating behavior. And so if a camera senses that something about Helen's facial cues suggests that she's anxious or distressed, some other system can intervene and try and regulate her affect in a more positive and less harmful direction. And then perhaps they can even provide personalized adaptive interfaces. So for example, it's not just a matter of automatically surfacing her favorite channels when she turns on her TV, but maybe over time, as Helen's cognitive decline intensifies, various interfaces around the house begin to simplify. They slowly change without her knowing it. They show fewer buttons, they present a simpler interface that allows her to interact with them in a skillful way, even as her cognitive condition declines. Now, the point of all this is that unlike Otto and his notebook, Helen won't have to do a lot of this offloading, this conforming the environment to herself. Her ASE will do this integrative work for her, and it will do so in at least two ways. First, I think this picture suggests that ambient smart environments will soon be able to develop modal supervision models. So building up these rich models of users that integrate data from audio, visual, movement sensors, along with AI-powered apps, all of which develop these very dynamic, continually updated models or profiles of Helen as she moves through the house and does things. And then secondly, by realizing unsupervised adaptation. That's where the SSL, self-supervised learning, comes in. These systems will be able to do this stuff on their own and adapt in real time and continuously update its models, both Helen and itself, over multiple timescales, and continue to provide very tailored support and care. And here's where the affect finally comes in. So what is the effective emotional significance of all of it? So some of you might know this. Have you read this in your reading group? Julia Peretta's wonderful article, What is an Affective Artifact? Oh, okay. You should write that down and read it in your group. It's really, really good. Julia is fantastic. It's a great article. So she develops this notion of what she calls an affective exoskeleton. And the basic idea is that in certain environments, our affective scaffolding, all the kind of the rich array of things we use to regulate our emotions and our affect from one moment to the next, becomes like a kind of a second body. It's this exoskeleton that we carry with us and move through the world and use to regulate our affect over multiple timescales. And I think Helen's home, we can see, again, isn't just going to have cognitive significance. It's going to become something like an affective exoskeleton, shifting and this dynamic assemblage of meshed AI-powered artifacts and digital models that will move and adapt with and to Helen in real time, regulating her, not just her cognition, her decision-making, her behavior, and her affect as well, and her emotions. And again, the whole point of this is it will do much of this anticipatory regulative work on its own. So White and Miller talk about this kind of upstream functionality of these systems. This is a way that they kind of anticipate what users are going to do. So they're not just regulating in the moment, they're anticipating what's coming next using predictive analytics and shaping the environment accordingly. And this anticipatory regulative work, I think, can take at least two forms. We can imagine many cases, and most of what I've talked about are ways that Helen's ambient smart environment will simplify her environment, surface information when she needs it, present reminders, maybe simplify interfaces, will ease her cognitive burden, in other words, by simplifying her environment. But we don't want our systems to be too transparent, too frictionless. There's also a value to a kind of friction, to environments that challenge and kind of push back a little. So we can imagine what we might call a kind of benign complexity. So always simplifying the environment isn't necessarily a good thing, certainly in the context of dementia care. There might be occasions, for example, where her environment will push back and say, look, you've been sitting for too long, maybe get up, maybe go do something. And it's just a little bit of friction to prompt exploratory modes, get her moving around the environment and kind of change, and kind of jolt her out of being overly passive. Okay, so I'm nearly done. I've gone on for a while. I'm nearly done. So final thoughts, and this is where I get into some of the worries. So I presented this kind of nice, cheery, shiny, happy case about how AI is going to make all of dementia care so much nicer and easier. It's going to alleviate all these issues. Clearly, there's a lot of ethical concerns, and there are some worries we can consider here. So just a couple of final thoughts. First off, one of the kind of the takeaways from this picture, thinking about AI extenders and the future of the extended mind, is that it reminds us that cognitive ecologies, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I realize that, cognitive ecologies are affective ecologies. In regulating and kind of shaping cognition, they're at the same time shaping affect. The two are deeply intertwined. And so these ambient smart environment scenarios, I think, really bring into sharp relief the tight link between cognition and affect. As we've seen, Helen's ambient smart environment isn't just an epistemic ecology, it's an affective ecology as well. It's saturated with an array of AI-powered regulative dynamics that shape feelings of intimacy, trust, security, and at-homeness. All these things are what help Helen feel more grounded in the world, more secure. And I think these feelings, alongside whatever other epistemic benefits of our ambient smart environment are present, are what help Helen feel so empowered in her home. And one of the reasons why I think users more generally feel so consistently empowered, dementia patients feel so empowered, they don't want to leave home. Their home is where Home is where they feel secure and empowered. And I think the ambient smart environments helped see how that feeling could be intensified and supported. But maybe even more interesting, and I think some of the implications for further implications for care. So I think Matilda Carter's work is relevant here. Matilda Carter has a number of really nice articles. The one I'm thinking of here is something called the direct approach towards a non-dominating dementia care. It's a really nice piece. And I think ambient smart environments, and AI-powered extenders or AI extenders more generally, offer promising pathways for better developing what Carter calls non-dominating, or sometimes she calls them indirect, materialities of care strategies. Oops. And so these are strategies that respect the individual's autonomy, their agency, their independence, their self-sufficiency. They're care strategies that instead of making decisions for the patient, bring the patient into the decision process. And I think that the durability and kind of the fluid self-referentiality, sorry, I think my jet lag's kicking in, I'm losing my ability to enunciate. The durability and fluid self-referentiality of ambient smart environments may prolong independent decision-making in dementia patients and delay the need to adopt more direct approaches that subvert their core values, for example, a desire for independence and autonomy. Okay, what are some worries? So I'm going to end with just a couple of worries, because there are really some worries. And those of you who are into this literature and you're into the scaffolding and the niche construction literature more generally, know that a recent important turn in these debates has been to consider what Sabrina Koenigs calls the dark side of niche construction, the way that we often talk about scaffolding as though it's this lovely positive thing that extends our mind and makes us better, more optimized agents. But we can scaffold the world in ways that work against us and other people as well. And so I want to end by considering some what I think are some genuine worries here. One worry is you might say, well, look, might this outside-in dynamic that I've been talking about, might this picture of the ambient smart environment doing all of this work for the individual and kind of reaching back toward the individual, might that actually diminish the individual's autonomy and independence? Might there be a sense in which the environment's doing so much work that we, in a sense, rob or strip the individual of their independence and autonomy? And I think Usman Haq, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, has considered this. He has a nice discussion of this in this article, Architecture Interaction System. And he says that one of the design principles we need to put into practice when thinking about designing ambient smart environments like this should be to support patterns of activities in which individuals, as he puts it, build up their spaces through conversation. So thinking about how we interact with spaces as a kind of conversation with the environment, where the history of interactions builds up new possibilities for sharing goals and outcomes. In other words, we ought to frame our design principles that govern how we think about these care strategies in ways that stress collaboration and coordination between the individual and their environment, not such that the environment's doing all the work for the individual. And I think a lot of times when big tech talks about the promise of AI, they often talk about it as though, look, don't worry about it, the robot's going to do it all. AI will do everything for you. That will free up all this time to go, I don't know, play video games or fish or whatever you want to do with your free time. I think that doesn't sound very collaborative. And so this notion of collaboration and coordination between the individual and the environment is a design principle Haidt says needs to be part of these discussions. But this is the last slide. I think there are other worries that I'm just going to flag. We can talk about these if you'd like to bring them up in the discussion. So I think there are at least two kinds or classes, we might say, of what I'll call digital vulnerability that I think ambient smart environments, especially in the context of dementia care, bring out. The first form of digital vulnerability is what I'm going to call functional vulnerability. These are kind of a kind of digital vulnerability that potentially impacts the individual's ability to function within their ambient smart environment. So for example, there are all sorts of security and safety concerns. So hacking, data breaches, failures. I mean, we're constantly reading about these systems of various kinds being hacked, our data being stolen, and obviously there's a range of security and safety concerns that have to be taken into account here. Another one is misinterpretations and errors. So I don't know if any of you spend much time interacting with these artificial systems, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whatever, but they routinely hallucinate, which is to say they make stuff up, they bullshit in Frankfurt sense of the term. And that's a problem for lots of reasons. But in this case, we can imagine hallucinations or bullshit happening when, for example, maybe Helen drops her keys or is doing yoga and bends over, and the system interprets that as some sort of a fall and alerts healthcare, the doctors, the paramedics come and they call her family, everyone comes, and Helen's just in her house doing her yoga, just chilling out. That not only is a waste of resources, it's going to bring a lot of emotional distress to the family, to Helen, and that's a very real concern. These systems are not as reliable as big tech would like us to think they are. Another important functional vulnerability is bias mitigation. And so these systems don't just hallucinate or bullshit, they reflect bias and prejudices. The bias and the prejudices that were built into the training data are reflected in the system. And there's already lots of evidence that certain minority groups receive disproportionately poor healthcare-related treatment and healthcare outcomes than do other groups. And so a lot of those same biases and prejudices will be present in these systems. And we have to be mindful of that. And then finally, some psychological vulnerabilities. So an obvious one is loss of privacy and autonomy. We think maybe not everyone's cool with the idea of Helen's house being full of video cameras and sensors monitoring her every movement, building up this multimodal map of her as she's moving throughout the house. Individuals might feel that their autonomy is diminished by this technology, even though supposed to support and empower them. Then social isolation, I think, is a big one. We can imagine cases where individuals become so attached to this tech. Maybe they're chatbots, they feel so secure at home, they don't want to go out and engage with other people and receive the embodied interaction that is so vital, especially for dementia patients. And then the last one is digital literacy. These systems are really complex. Most of us have no idea how they work, and we're potentially giving over a lot of our life to them, and especially individuals in a very vulnerable state. And so I think being transparent about this data and how these systems work is going to be really key when it comes to implementing them in this context. Having said all of that, I still think there's a lot of promise here. I think these things can do a lot of interesting work. And I think people who are interested in the extended mind and AI ought to be part of that conversation. That's it. Thank you. Way too long. Much longer than I expected. Sorry.
No, it's fine. We started 10 minutes late,
Yeah,
so 50 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, not quite as long as I thought. All right. Okay, same.
Okay, so we'll start the Q&A session. Thank you, all. Please raise your hand. Okay. Please.
Thanks very much for your very interesting talk. I would like to know, to ask you to extend it for the notion of agency.
I was afraid someone's going to ask about agency.
When you say the artifacts, AI artifacts, have a significant degree of cognitive agency and autonomy, okay. But isn't the agency something that we ascribe to the object?
Yeah.
Because I think this
Sorry, I'm going to stand.
a very important thing. For me, they have no agency, the powers goes off and they don't exist.
No, that's a very fair point. Although if my powers goes off, I don't exist. I lose my agency. So I mean, and I'm not being flippant when I say that. I mean, there's a sense in which I think agency is always contingent on other factors. So, do you have a good definition of agency?
No, that's why I came to the work.
Oh, no, you came to the wrong talk, man, because I don't have a good definition of agency. No, I think so. I use it in a very no, that's a really important point. And I'm being jokey about it, but that's a really important point. I guess when I talk about agency, all I mean is that these systems do things, and crucially, they can do things without supervision, without users having to be in the control loop. And so they have something. I mean, again, I don't know how much of what I want to say hangs on, whether or not you want to call it agency, whether or not you want to call it, schmagency, agency light, some other terminology. All I'm focusing on is that these things can do things, and they can teach themselves things. They can be responsive to the environment and to the individuals that they're monitoring, and they can do all of this without users being in the control. And that's a pretty robust sense of something like agency, which makes this interesting. So beyond that, I don't have a good definition of agency, and others have. If you read the manuscript, I have a little footnote, but because I have a terrible memory, I've forgotten. There are about 4 references in there of people who have developed some really nice discussion of agency in the context of artificial systems. And so there are people working on this. it's.
I would be interested.
Yeah, so if you send me an email, I'm happy to, it's just, I can send it to you and anyone who wants, I'm happy to distribute it. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Conference.
Thanks so much, it was very interesting. I was thinking of the last phrase you said, that we should bring engineers and philosophers into the conversation of how to implement this tool, the new tool. And I was thinking that your talk is about dementia care. And dementia is a condition, a clinical condition. Care is a clinical intervention.
Yeah.
So thinking as well on this aspect of the dark side of this technology, maybe something that could be very helpful is to have very clear propedeutics, very clear clinical guidelines
Yeah,
where clinicians like psychologists or doctors can come into the picture and tell, okay, maybe this technology is not it's not indicated in this
yeah,
case,
Yeah.
it is in this case. So as
Yeah.
not to become overgeneralized with this
Yeah.
optimism and maybe do more harm than good. We should
Yeah.
be very mindful of for whom this is a good tool, and maybe for someone else needs to develop a little bit more I don't know, stability in their lives. Maybe
Yeah.
someone's very grumpy and they are going to become depressed because I want to do it and the machines do it.
Yes.
Maybe this guy needs to
Yeah.
first become depressed or more open, and maybe bringing this into the conversation, because I believe it's a very interesting tool, but we need to be very, I would advise to be very careful and
Yeah.
not be over optimistic that this is going to change everything.
oh
for
gosh,
everyone.
no, I could not agree more, and I really mean what I say, when I said at the beginning, I'm not some naive techno-optimist. Technology will save us all. And I know you were saying that, but I mean, I really do mean that, despite this was a relatively, cheery and optimistic talk. I do think there are a lot of significant issues, and I tried to flag some of them. But I think you also have made a really good point that, this might not be for everybody. I mean, people are complex, and the conditions that we develop and experience are complex. And so I'm certainly not as a philosopher going to say, well, here's what, every form of dementia care going forward should look like. That would be very naive and certainly arrogant if we got the training or expertise to do that. But what I will say, I mean, my general sense of just getting into the literature, the dementia care literature the last year or so, which I have been, I should say, sorry, this is a little tangent. This interest came out of a workshop that I was part of about a year and a half ago. So I'm guessing people in here know Danielle Petherbridge. It's not a name that's familiar to any of you, phenomenologist at University College Dublin, which has great work on feminist phenomenology and other things. Axel Honneth and recognition. She had a conference on dementia. Embodied approaches to dementia, brought together phenomenologists, philosophers, and people, carers, and people in clinical training, a couple doctors. It's just a really lovely conference that I was part of. And I found in that conversation both that a lot of people in dementia care were really excited about phenomenological and embodied approaches to cognition, because they challenge this default way of thinking about dementia care in personhood that's persisted for a long time. That namely, once the person's cognitive faculties start to decline, once they lose their memory, the self goes with it. And of course, thinking is, thinking about a dementia patient as someone who essentially now lacks the self, frames what sort of intervention strategies you think are appropriate. You think it's okay to not engage with them because they can't respond anyways. And so this embodied perspective argues for what I think is much more compassionate and empathic approach. The self is still there, it's embodied, even if aspects of the individual, cognitive aspects are declined. And so if you take that embodied perspective seriously, the environment becomes part of the story. Thinking about what kind of environments can we construct to support the bodily self that is still very much present in dementia. And so that's what I think that informs more kind of environment-centered strategies that are starting to emerge. The materialities of care perspective, and some other, I think, similar strategies. So it's a long-winded way of saying, that's how I'd like to situate, I think, this work. It's just part of these more general strategies that are thinking about, what kind of more compassionate possibilities are there for dementia care that respect the individual's bodily identity and, the kind of environments of care that we're constructing around them. to that, of course.
Thank you. Amen.
Well, thank you for your talk. I was thinking about the suffering.
Hmm.
Because, I don't know, for example, I am not, I don't think it's such a good example, the auto notebook.
Hmm.
Because a patient with dementia, it's suffering. No?
Yeah.
It's full of things, it's not thinking about having a notebook,
Yeah.
you know? So I think it's a very, I don't know, I think it's like zombie examples or,
Yeah.
you know, like, I think it's like more a mental, mental experiment,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I think it's more close to that. So in that same logic, I want to ask you, now, what do you think about that? No? Because that's very nice, and I know that you are like trying to put that in discussion, and that's perfect. But I don't know. I agree with this phenomenology perspective. Now, maybe it's important to understand narratives,
Yeah.
pain, isolation. Now, like all this suffering experience that all these patients suffering.
Yeah.
So, and all that stuff, it's I don't know, I think it's worthless, no? Because
Yeah.
you are not like I think it's important this first person perspective, no?
Yeah.
From a people that is not here, no? It's terrible when you don't share the reality with your husband. It's, you know, and you're not thinking, oh, I'm going to talk to Aurora, or I don't know, to Celia.
No, I agree.
So, what do you think about
Yeah, that's
this
a really good point.
suffering experience in the
So,
dementia?
no, I really appreciate you saying that. I mean, there is, of course, a lot of suffering in dementia. And for what it's worth, my father died a couple of years ago, and he was a brilliant guy. He was a minister, and he had a photographic memory. He spoke, I think, 13 languages. He could get by like another 10 on top of that, as he put it. So, I mean, he knew over 20 languages. He had, PhD, multiple master's degrees. And it was really difficult for me to watch his decline in his final years. So he had dementia, and he started to forget things. He would go downtown and get lost in the car. So we eventually had to take away his driver's license. He was somebody who just could naturally find his way anywhere. And he just had an incredible sense of navigation, orientation. He lost that. He was confused even just going around the house. And of course, he knew that was happening. I mean, that's a very common part of dementia characters, or narratives. Individuals have a very clear sense that something about their grip on the world is changing. They feel less grounded and losing their grip on the world and their ability to stay rooted in it. And that's an incredibly distressing experience. And of course, there's suffering on the other side as well. And he died before it got too bad, which in some ways, I'm oversharing, but I mean, in some ways it was a relief because I didn't have to see him in the more extreme examples that in cases that others have to see their loved ones go through. And I guess the point of that is, I absolutely take the point about suffering, but I think this is just one part of maybe a large kind of suite or repertoire of strategies that can help alleviate the suffering. I mean, we can help individuals live more autonomous, independent lives, stay at home a bit longer, for example, maintain their autonomy, their independence. That's one way of alleviating suffering, especially early on. I mean, there might be cases, and of course there would be later stages of dementia and Alzheimer's where no matter how much smart tech you have, you're not able to care for yourself. And then assisted living is the only outcome. But I guess ideally, part of how we think about it is precisely to address the suffering that you're talking about. Not to pretend it doesn't exist, it's kind of right in the way, but to develop strategies that, as best we can, help to alleviate. So I really take that point, and I wouldn't want to at all, portray this as just kind of this happy, sunny, easy solution that's going to get rid of all suffering. That's very naive. I don't think that at all. So I really take this
Ahora,
So imagining that we have this technology, I see that there's two possible paths. Either regulation to see what are going to be the limits, or prohibition.
Yeah.
With the chatbots and so on.
Yeah.
So the reason for prohibiting talking with a ghost on your computer is that it doesn't allow you to really go through the suffering and take it in, because you will never go over it, because you cannot re-narrate yourself.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
what?
the grief bot, or the chat bot that we were talking about, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what, that would be so that is so bad that it's better not to have the good aspect of it rather than just prohibit it.
Yeah,
Because many people are gonna be affected by not being able to admit that someone
yeah.
has passed away. So what do you think, it's like two questions, but what do you think would be a good enough reason to prohibit this kind of technology?
Oh, man, yeah.
Like what would be that good enough to say like, if it happens, this one,
No, that's good.
we shall not pursue this path because it's too bad, which is what happens with self-driving cars.
Yeah.
They work on at night.
I was just thinking that.
Also-
To be honest, the first phase that came into my head when it was Elon Musk. And so, I mean, I don't trust him, and I don't trust big tech. So that's one reason. I really don't. And I don't trust them to have my or our best interests at heart when designing and implementing this tech. I really don't think they do. And so I'm super skeptical of their motives and, you know, their any sort of sensitivity to the duty of care they might have to users who use their services, including in really vulnerable patients like dementia care.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, I just don't trust big tech. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm not comfortable with, you know, I mean, something like Google, for example, I mean, they're developing all this AI technology, but obviously that's all profit driven. It's, you know, and they claim that it's not a way of gathering user data to, you know, to feed their ad revenue. I don't see any reason to believe them.
Exactly.
And I say that as someone who uses Gemini every day. I actually, not just because I write on this stuff, I like technology. I figure I should know how this works and we'll be talking about it. And I still use it, but I know that they are hoovering up my data and learning stuff about me that I probably don't want them to learn.
Yeah.
So that lack of trust maybe in the current companies designing, building, and implementing this is probably one compelling reason to be skeptical of this. And I don't know if it means building a whole kind of separate non-commercial ecosystem of companies that can design and implement this tech. That might be one way of ameliorating that concern. Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I'm very open to others suggesting other reasons to be skeptical because I really want to think through, you know, what are the potential dark side.
Yeah, and also the gap that it creates between people who can access it or people.
So that's another one, yeah.
Who haven't up to challenge for dead people.
Yes, issues of justice and accessibility.
Yeah,
And I
but
flag
you can chat
that.
with someone for a year or so, and
Yeah.
after that you have to start paying.
Yeah.
So only the ones.
No, exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly, and I'm imagining all sorts of gross, like ads being placed, you know, when, you know, Helen's chatbot is talking to her one morning, hey, Helen, you know, you slept 9.5 hours last night, that's, you know, that's a long time, you're probably pretty groggy. Let me put on, you know, let me order you a Starbucks, you know, pumpkin spice latte, it's autumn, it's fall, and, you know, Starbucks has a sale on this week, and let's go get a pumpkin spice latte. I mean, you can imagine all sorts of really gross things that these companies.
That already happens.
Yeah.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, and it certainly can happen here as well.
I can imagine an example. I was talking to my husband this morning, like, where do you get if you put something on ChatGPT, you say like, give me, my son had to write an essay on, let's talk about Kevin.
Yes, yeah.
And he had to talk about the perspective with Freud, different psychiatrists and philosophers and stuff. So he put the answers. So
Yeah.
he just has like, give me the highlights, like show me the highlights.
Yeah.
So from those highlights, he wrote a paper. Like, oh, now I have the
Yeah.
idea, I don't have to read watch the movie, I just have to write something. The problem is who puts all the data for ChatGPT to give it back to you.
Yeah, well, all of us.
So
I mean, that's.
by using maybe,
Thing.
no, but like you are one of the users, like
Yeah.
a lot of people, but then there's some supernatural, who says like, we only like opinions that have this kind of information, like pro-Israel against Gaza or what, no? You just like start, and then you start creating people who think or who just start writing
Yeah.
the way you like it. There must be a limit to it. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things where you just have to say like, stop it, or just like, because it's so easy to use and people think that that's, oh, it's so fast, it's real. They don't give it a second thought. Like, who is
So
behind
I
this
think what you
information?
just said is really key, and I don't have a good answer to any of these things, because they're really big, complicated questions. But as a teacher, I think one of the things that I hopefully will do is to teach my students a kind of literacy and a kind of critical, skeptical literacy when using these things. So I'm very open with them. I say that, look, I do sometimes use these tools for idea generation. I will kind of have a conversation with Gemini about a topic and ask certain questions. If I'm starting a paper, I want to kind of brainstorm, and let's say my colleague Tom isn't in his office, I can't go down the hall and talk to him. I'll have a chat with ChatGPT or Gemini. And I see these, at least in my case, these tools filling a useful kind of idea generating, kind of creative engine starting. But then I also.
I'm sorry, we have other
But
questions.
just to say, but then I think it's part to teach our students, say, look, it's fine to use them for this, but then always be critical of what they're saying and don't take it at face value. Don't think that then just copying and pasting it is the full story. You need to develop additional critical skills to kind of analyze and sift and think through the information it's generating before you start to do something with it. So teaching them digital literacy, I think, is really important. Maybe that's naive, because they're students, they're just going to copy and paste it anyways, but I'd like to think they're not. Yeah.
You see, Miguel.
Yes, thank you for your thought, Joel. I think I'm going to say already and on the table, but just to make it explicit, because when I heard the question about agency, I think one problem also is like what is the ethical responsibility also of saying that something has agency or not?
Yeah.
In that sense, and because in this idea from inactive ethics that we need our to mix our ontology, epistemology, and ethical concerns.
Yeah.
Probably, I think that we usually is like, okay, we have this development and artificial intelligence, and then we think what to do, but what if we start also by thinking of all those ethical concerns, because yes, I think it's wonderful what the example you're doing, and I can find like even with I think with the things that could be concerns, I think it's great, but I also thinking precisely this is not the relation just of these people with all these technological environment, with the engineers that are doing this, with the companies that came, with the grid, and probably the rich people will have with Alzheimer have these environments. Not everybody, for sure, because that's what it's carried in the whole system. That's
And so I agree with everything you just said. I think I lost a little bit at the end. And what's the connection with agency, or is the idea more that
it's connected in the idea of thinking from agency, not just about having information, because I have one probably from an activist, but it's so an ethical concern and political.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I think one of the very important contributions of an active approach is just Fourier approaches more generally is to broaden our conception of agency. Agency isn't something that's just confined to the individual. The sense in which, if we take scaffolding and niche construction, affordances, and all these concepts and frameworks that we like, it really broadens how we think about agency. I mean, there's a sense in which Otto's agency, cognitive agency, and certainly other kinds of agency were literally extended. And we incorporated this notebook into its cognitive system. But I think as you highlighted, and as I've tried to suggest as well, there is a dark side to all of this. I mean, there's a kind of vulnerability potentially emerges when we think about agency in this really distributed sense, where others are playing a really deep role in shaping not just what our agency looks like, but how we can or cannot enact it. And I think I take all these concerns very seriously. And I don't love the idea of Elon Musk kind of getting all up in my agency. I really don't. I mean, again, I broken record. I don't trust him. I don't trust big tech to have my best interests at heart. And so I really mean that when I say I'm very skeptical of their motives and interests. And I think if something like this goes forward, I think I ideally would like to see some sort of non-commercial, independent cluster of companies involved in designing these systems. Again, maybe that's naive. In fact, I'm sure it's naive.
Okay, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. The first one is more everything. And it's the question is with this AI extenders is sort of the goal to delay the diminution of the cognitive functions of the person who's suffering dementia, or to help him or her functioning longer with the same sort of deterioration. I don't know if
Hmm.
you know, it's slightly different.
Yeah, tell me why, that's an interesting distinction. Tell me why you think that's important. Is that just important ethically? Or you're just interested in terms
it
of
would do
what?
something, I mean, it would do something different if it helps delay the deterioration.
Yeah,
If it sort of makes it slower. Because that would help, that would change the way the person interacts, is able to interact with the world
yeah,
at large, in
gotcha.
general.
That's nice.
And the other thing is more like the person being able to manage being at home
Good, yeah.
autonomously. But yeah, and I think that makes sort of
So,
important.
good. No, I think, if I remember correctly, Clark and Drayson addressed this in their article. And it's been a long time since I've looked at that piece, but I think they make a distinction between, what do they call it? Restorative versus compensatory strategy. So a restorative strategy essentially is trying to get, for example, someone with Alzheimer's, kind of restore lost cognitive function and to kind of get them back up to where they were, and hopefully support their independent living. And a compensatory strategy, on the other hand, recognizes that cognitive decline is inevitable. You're not going to be able to get them back to where they were because that's just not how dementia Alzheimer's works. So you devise alternative strategies that help them compensate for the loss in one area by developing skills and capacities in another. And so I think the compensatory strategy is one that Drayson and Clark say that is the strategy that was adopted by the people that Carolyn Baum was looking at. So they were not, their cognitive decline was continuous, but they had devised this whole complicated, rich set of practices that helped them to compensate, which let them live on their own in St. Louis. And so I think something like this picture is probably more of a compensatory strategy. And again, maybe that's going to vary by case, because dementia, there really isn't, as far as we know, a way of restoring lost cognitive function, because that's just not how it works. Once certain cognitive and neural functions are gone, they don't come back. And so that's why compensatory becomes more important. But it can be empowering too, because I think that's part of this narrative where it's not as though then we focus on what the person is lost. We instead kind of shift the focus on what they still can do and devise ways to support them. And that's, I think, what this compensatory approach potentially gives us. That's maybe the more kind of practical, even ethical payoff to all of this. Does that address your question? It's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, no, my second question was really related to the one of your points in the psychological worries when you refer to the social isolation. And you say that the people would have this feeling that they are losing their grip on the world. And I was wondering how this sort of setting, smart setting, would make so much different the experience of the world at large at home. It's like minus home, but the world becomes a lot more stranger and I don't know how to put it, hostile.
Hostile, less predictable. Scary.
Exactly, especially if you're getting used to being in a much more, nicer, controlled way. Much more difficult to navigate in a world without all those features. So that was one of my.
I think it's a very legitimate concern. I mean, and again, I guess, the point would just be that this would have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and where, but I can very much see maybe part of, again, kind of the dark side of the emotional impact of all of this could be kind of making individuals perhaps even a little more anxious, a little more scared, less confident, disempowered when it comes to going back out into the real world, so to speak. And because home is safe and secure and home does everything I want, it's completely wrapped itself around me. Why would I leave my little ASE cocoon? I'm happy here. And I think that's a real danger, especially when in dementia care, there's a lot of evidence that suggests, social contact, embodied face-to-face contact is really key for slowing down.
And that was my sort of the last part of my question, really. What about interaction with other people? Let's say loved ones who go to visit. And how would that work? Because the person is constantly interacting with all these things. And how do you keep a conversation when you need something that is telling you this is a bottle? And hard to imagine that, how
Yeah, no, and again,
human interaction work
Yeah.
when it's sort of mediated with the things that help you navigate things. How would
Yeah.
that help navigate interaction, human interaction?
well, I don't know if I would see it as mediating so much as sort of existing alongside human interaction. So ideally, there still would be a caregiver coming by on a regular basis. I mean, again, this is a question of accessibility. You know, who can afford this sort of care? Who can afford both a smart environment and in-home visits from a carer? But in an ideal world, this would just be one part of a package of treatment strategies. So, you know, maybe people with dementia who want it can have this sort of smart environment, but then there is, you know, some sort of professional care coming by once a day or every other day to check in on them, talk to them, spend time with them. Ideally, family members are stopping by on a regular basis, and lots of embodied contact, social, emotional support, face-to-face interaction. Again, I wouldn't at all suggest this is just, you know, functionally they're all equivalent, doesn't really matter. I don't want to say that at all. And I think this would need to be supplemented with a lot of embodied social face-to-face support as well.
Next. I have only a few comments. I think that as presented, this is like a perfect image of a post-human world.
Yeah.
Maybe for societies as all of Mexico, it's like we are not prepared to accept this kind of solitude, no?
Yeah.
The person like helped by technology, but
Yeah.
maybe in Nordic societies is
Yeah.
perfectly understandable this kind of solution, no?
Yeah.
Where people solitude and autosufficiency is
Yeah.
like a social
Yeah.
social value.
Yeah.
Maybe we are not prepared in some societies to accept this post-human image of human
Yeah.
life.
Well, to be very clear, I mean, this connects, I think, with what I was just saying. So I would be as unhappy if, you know, this technology got to a point where something like this could actually be implemented. If suddenly the dominant care strategy in dementia was, okay, now we have smart homes, we can just put dementia patients in their own smart home, lock the door, and then just check on them every 6 months to make sure they're okay. I mean, obviously that'd be awful, so I'm not at all advocating that. But I mean, at the same time, a lot of times, you know, what happens, I'm not trying to impute, you know, care workers, I mean, you know, people going to this line of work are generally very compassionate people, but resources are limited. People, you know, resources are stressed and stretched thin. So a lot of times under this, you know, kind of deficiency and cognitive loss model of dementia, individuals get put into a care home with carers and other people, but then it's assumed, well, there's no one left, so to speak. So they don't have people coming in every day to talk to them, engaging with them, trying to stimulate them, playing music. They're essentially, you know, put in a room and given just enough to keep their biological, you know, body alive, but they're not being fed at a subjective or experiential level. And so, I mean, obviously both scenarios are bad, and ideally something in between then would be, you know, the solution. Yeah.
In some societies, not all societies.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. I think it has spread out lots of concerns and I think
Yeah, no, this is all great. This is, I want these ethical concerns.
so I have 3 questions, but one is very theoretical or more of your previous works because today I felt like you separate cognition and affectivity, and I would like you to go a little bit into that. Or you mentioned a few words that you could say that, you know, that you are separating them.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you are doing it like that.
Well, so to be very clear, I mean, there was a slide at the end where I said, I think one of the takeaways was that actually this picture stresses the intermingling of cognition and affect. And I probably didn't bring that out quite as much. Maybe that comes out a bit clearer in the article, but I think all of the kind of cognitive extensions that I was talking about have affective significance. And so again, I think all of this, all the different sort of cognitive functions, this ambient smart environment we came over, would at the same time have deep affective and emotional significance for Helen or anyone else. I mean, generating a feeling of trusting in their space, feeling more confident and empowered. This is all effectively rich stuff. And so I think the affect is always there. Even if I was focusing more on some of the cognitive stuff, I wouldn't want to separate
Okay.
the two. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, thanks.
I got a little bit that.
Yeah. No.
and then you said the dark side of that of niche construction.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what you really mean with that, because I think niche construction is there anyway, like,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know if you're going like to evolution of species with that kind of niche. Like what would
Yeah.
happen if we get that kind of niche scaffolded by machines or whatever? Like is that, I don't know what you're.
Oh, sorry, no, so there,
about
that's not my expression. Sabrina Koenigs is a philosopher, German philosopher at in Amsterdam. She's the one, it just came out a year or two ago, an article, I think it's actually called The Dark Side of Niche Construction, then there's a subtitle. It's a really nice article. And it basically looks at some of the negative consequences of niche construction. And so issues, for example, of, you know, I don't remember her dominant example. Well, so David Spurritt is another philosopher. You might know his work. He has talked about, so for example, gambling machines. He kind of uses Giovanna's example that she talked about years ago in her book of the way that gambling machines and casinos are set up to kind of scaffold this addictive, obsessive, you know, quality, and just you kind of the way you sit in front of the gambling machine, you sit in a chair, you're comfortable, people bring you drinks in the casino, you're completely focused in. Just the way the game and the whole scaffolding is set up, it locks you into this kind of addictive, just one more time, okay, just that's the last one, no, just one more. And then 3 hours later, you've lost all your money, you know, you're drunk, you're, you know, and you've essentially, you know, you've done something you probably shouldn't have. And that's one example of the kind of dark side of scaffolding, where environments kind of manipulate us in all sorts of ways, whether it's addictive behavior, whether it's kind of, you know, political manipulation, kind of diminish our agency, our autonomy, this sort of thing.
Okay,
That's what I meant.
Okay, and then I think I got that, what I wanted to ask like precisely, but then that gets me to the third question, which is, I just got a lot of like senses of Black Mirror, of course.
Yes.
But, and I remember this, I don't know if you saw that chapter when a woman loses her husband, and then
Be right back,
they bring a robot. So I wonder if, for example, if you make a chatbot of your deceased one, and you get not like horrified by it because it's boring, like in the chapter, no? It's boring, it's not the same, because based on the conversations and whatever, so it gets the dark side of the chatbot, and it brings you more suffering than positive feelings. And that goes along with the other thing, that if you have this, you could use it for many other purposes, like growing babies, for example. And that would have a
growing babies.
Yeah, like for example, taking care of children. Right?
Oh, I see.
Growing
babies in a test tube or something. Okay, gotcha.
But I get it.
So like childcare, yeah.
Like childcare, and then get
That's good.
A way of educating in the same way and creating like very little agency.
That's good. I mean, that wouldn't be good, but that's a good example of the dark side.
Of the dark side, so I would worry about using, because for this example, it's very nice, no? I mean, taking care of someone that has dementia, but then you could use it to, like, on the other spectrum of life, you know, like
that's a good example. I mean, there's a sense, of course, in which the technology that already exists has this dark side. Just go with your example. I mean, so, you know, I'm someone who I've outed myself as a gamer. I like to play games, but you know, and I'd like to think that I do it responsibly. I managed to hold down a job and maintain something of a professional career, so I'm not completely addicted to my gaming.
But I have to go.
No, but
Sorry.
obviously, you know,
Sorry.
I mean, the kind of games I play, the amount of games I play aren't appropriate for children. I mean, you know, children can certainly get very addicted to gaming, and a lot of parents, and I shouldn't say a lot, I don't know if it's true or not, but certainly some parents use games, TV programs, tablets, internet stuff as a stand-in for other things. And so I know parenting's hard. I'm not a parent, so this is not at all, don't, you know, hear this as me being judgy. Parenting stuff, I realize that. But I just, you know, well, now I'm gonna be judgy. I know, like I watch my brother sometimes when my niece was young. Sometimes I felt that he was using, you know, he was letting her on a tablet more than I would have if she were my daughter. And he's a great daddy, very clear. But yeah, is he watching me, by the way? But the point is, I mean, so there's dark side to all this technology, and I think, you know, it can be used in all sorts of potentially maladaptive or dangerous ways. I hadn't thought about this potential context or this case study though in that way, and like kind of substitute child rearing. You can think of other potentially maybe less happy uses for this. That's really interesting. So let's think about that one. That's a nice example. But again, it just shows you why thinking about the ethical consequences of all this is so important. And I just really will re-emphasize, if you haven't come across this, so there is this emerging discussion about bad scaffolding, as it's sometimes called, or the dark side of niche construction. And Giovanna, David Spirit, and John Sutton are co-editing a forthcoming issue, Topoi, on bad scaffolding. And there are already a bunch of articles that have come out in this issue about just the negative consequences of scaffolding in niche construction. So it's very much something people are talking about, the politics of scaffolding, basically. And so people at least becoming more sensitive to this. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Last question. Oh,
Well, my question was more or less the same as Jessica's about the social.
Yeah.
Because if you live there, then maybe the family takes you out and you really get anxious because you have nothing that is there in the room where you
Yeah.
live. And so that can bring really bad side
Yeah.
effects, psychological. And then maybe you can only live in that room.
Yeah.
Because all other kinds of interaction is impossible.
No, I agree. And the only thing I would have to say in response to that is to again kind of highlight this idea of talking about of a kind of what I call a benign friction or kind of a benign complexity. So the point of this wouldn't be to make everything so smooth, so seamless, so perfect that individuals would never want to leave that space. There would be a value to introducing a little friction every now and then to prompt people to get up and exercise, or I don't know, maybe that sounds a little bit too heavy-handed, but just find ways to bring a little bit of friction into the system so that individuals don't just sit there on a couch and let the machines do everything. I mean, you want some sort of, prompting or nudging to keep being engaged with the environment, active, exploring, and hopefully, empowering individuals to be comfortable enough to go out every now and then if they're still able to. So that's not a very good answer, but it's just a way of acknowledging that is very much a concern. The social side of all of this would have to be brought into these considerations.
And also the touching, say hugging and.
Oh, the physical contact is essential, absolutely. So important for dementia care, embodied physical contact,
And Helen wouldn't have that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully Helen has family and friends around. Or Otto, remember she was like Otto, so Otto comes over and, I don't know, maybe they have a little romance going on, I don't know. You can fill in the narrative however you want.
okay. We're out of time with.
Can I just say one thing? Maybe Helen is sitting in her sofa watching TV, having all the gadgets telling her what to do, and then a friend comes by and she's like, "What are you doing here? You're just like disturbing everything."
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Like, "Oh, I'm so comfy here. What are you doing?" Thank you.
Thank you all, it's great, thank you.
Our session tomorrow, it's not here, it's in the Unidad de Posgrado, room J306.
La unidad de posgrados, ¿en qué salón es?
J306.
Hay estacionamiento en la unidad, ¿no?